when 28-year-old Thomas Mitchell stepped onto the Family Feud stage with his left sleeve pinned neatly where his arm should have been. He moved with the confident precision of someone who had learned to navigate the world differently. But when he answered, "Give up on your dreams," to a question about what's impossible to do with one hand, he began sharing a story that would prove sometimes losing everything you think you need reveals everything you actually have. Thomas walked with purpose across the stage, his right hand moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 3 years learning to accomplish with one limb what most people took for granted with two. There was no self-consciousness in his movement, no attempt to hide his prosthetic arm or minimize his difference. Instead, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced his worst fear and discovered it wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a better one. The Mitchell family had made the journey from Portland, Oregon, with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. There was Patricia Mitchell, 58, Thomas's mother, a retired nurse who had spent 3 years learning alongside her son how to adapt recipes, kitchen techniques, and cooking methods to accommodate his new reality. His father, Robert, 61, a carpenter who had built custom kitchen equipment and adaptive tools to help Thomas pursue his culinary dreams, despite his physical limitations. His younger sister, Amy, 25, a nutritionist, who had become Thomas's business partner in planning their dream restaurant, a place where disabled individuals could work in professional kitchens, proving that physical limitations don't limit culinary creativity. And his girlfriend, Sarah, 27, a food photographer who had documented Thomas's journey back to cooking, creating a visual story of adaptation, determination, and the refusal to let trauma define possibility. But it was Thomas himself who commanded attention, not because of what he was missing, but because of what he had gained. His passion for cooking was immediately obvious in the way he talked about food, the precision with which he moved, the confidence that came from someone who had rebuilt his entire relationship with his greatest love and emerged stronger than before. Thomas had been a sous chef at one of Portland's most prestigious restaurants when the motorcycle accident happened 3 years earlier. He had been riding home from work on a rainy November evening when a drunk driver ran a red light, sending Thomas's bike skidding across 4 lanes of traffic. The impact had crushed his left arm so severely that doctors had no choice but to amputate just below the shoulder. For Thomas, losing his arm felt like losing his identity. Cooking had been his passion since childhood, his profession for 8 years, his entire sense of purpose and self-worth. Professional kitchens demanded speed, precision, and the ability to multitask in ways that seemed impossible with one hand. The thought of never again being able to julienne vegetables, flip pans, or plate dishes with the artistry that had defined his career felt like a death sentence for everything he cared about. The first year after the accident had been the darkest period of his life. Depression had consumed him as he struggled with phantom limb pain, the frustration of learning basic tasks with one hand, and the crushing belief that his culinary dreams were permanently finished. He had avoided kitchens entirely, unable to face the space where he had once felt most alive but now felt only loss and limitation. But gradually, with the support of his family and the encouragement of his girlfriend Sarah, Thomas had begun to experiment with adaptive cooking techniques. It started small, learning to crack eggs one-handed, figuring out how to stabilize cutting boards, discovering knife techniques that worked with his changed body. Each small victory had built confidence, and confidence had rebuilt his relationship with the kitchen. The breakthrough had come when Thomas realized that losing his arm hadn't taken away his palate, his creativity, or his understanding of flavor and technique. It had simply required him to find new ways to express the same passion. He began developing cooking methods specifically designed for people with one arm, creating kitchen tools and techniques that could be used by disabled chefs, and documenting his discoveries for others facing similar challenges. The idea for opening a restaurant staffed primarily by disabled individuals had emerged from Thomas's growing recognition that the culinary world was missing enormous talent by assuming that physical differences meant professional limitations. He envisioned a place where blind chefs could use their heightened senses of smell and taste, where chefs in wheelchairs could demonstrate that mobility wasn't required for culinary excellence, where amputee chefs like himself could prove that creativity mattered more than the number of limbs. The decision to apply for Family Feud had been Amy's suggestion, born from her belief that their family's story could inspire other people facing similar challenges while also raising awareness about disability in professional kitchens. Thomas had been hesitant initially. Public attention felt overwhelming, and he was still sensitive about being seen primarily as an inspirational figure rather than simply a talented chef. But his family had convinced him that sharing his story could help change perceptions about disability and professional capability, potentially opening doors for other disabled individuals who had been told their dreams were impossible. Steve Harvey had been briefed about Thomas's background during rehearsal, but meeting him in person revealed layers of determination and passion that couldn't be captured in a production note. There was something immediately compelling about Thomas's presence, not because of his disability, but because of the obvious depth of his commitment to his craft and his refusal to let physical limitations define professional possibilities. "Thomas," Steve had said during the family introductions, "tell us what you do for work." "I'm a chef," Thomas had replied confidently, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned that title through both formal training and hard-won experience. "I specialize in adaptive cooking techniques, and I'm working on opening a restaurant that will employ disabled chefs." "That's incredible," Steve had said, and the audience had responded with appreciative applause. "It's necessary," Thomas had corrected gently. "There are incredibly talented cooks out there who've been told they can't work in professional kitchens because of their disabilities. I want to prove that wrong." The game had progressed through 3 rounds, with the Mitchell family showing strong chemistry and competitive spirit. Thomas had contributed thoughtful answers, his responses revealing both culinary knowledge and the kind of problem-solving mindset that came from having to find creative solutions to everyday challenges. When asked to name something that takes practice to get right, he had confidently answered, "Knife skills," earning the number 2 spot on the board, and knowing nods from anyone who had ever tried to cook professionally. But it was during the 4th round that everything changed. The question seemed designed to challenge assumptions. Name something that's impossible to do with one hand. The competing family had just missed their opportunity to control the board, and it was the Mitchell family's chance to steal. Robert had given the first answer, clap, which had earned a respectable spot, but had made Thomas smile at the obvious answer that most people would give. Patricia had followed with tie shoes, another response that reflected conventional thinking about one-handed limitations. Now it was Thomas's turn. He stepped forward to the podium, and for a moment he looked thoughtful, not uncertain, but considering how to express something that challenged the fundamental assumption behind the question itself. When he spoke, his voice carried across the studio with a conviction that made everyone listen. "Give up on your dream." The words hung in the air with a weight that seemed to transform the entire nature of the question. The audience fell quiet, sensing that this wasn't just a clever game show answer, but a deeply personal statement about possibility, limitation, and the power of human determination. Steve's expression changed immediately. The entertainer's smile, the quick wit, the practiced responses, all of it fell away as he processed what Thomas had just said and understood the layers of meaning behind it. "Thomas," Steve said softly, setting down his cards and approaching him, "that's not just an answer. That's a philosophy." Thomas nodded, his confidence growing as he realized he had an opportunity to share something important with a much larger audience than he had ever reached before. "It's the truth," Thomas replied simply. "I lost my arm 3 years ago in a motorcycle accident. Everyone told me my career as a chef was over. But the only thing that's really impossible to do with one hand is give up on what matters to you." Steve looked at this remarkable young man, who had turned what others saw as a career-ending injury into an opportunity to revolutionize how people think about disability and professional capability. "Tell me about that," Steve said. "What was it like to lose your arm and think your culinary career was finished?" Thomas took a moment to consider the question, clearly comfortable discussing his experience, but wanting to convey the complexity of his journey accurately. "It was devastating," he said honestly. "Cooking wasn't just my job, it was who I was. I thought that without 2 hands I couldn't be a real chef. I avoided kitchens for almost a year because being in them reminded me of everything I thought I'd lost. He paused, looking at his family, drawing strength from their obvious support and pride. But then I realized I was asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, how can I cook the way I used to? I started asking, how can I cook the way I am now? And that changed everything. Steve nodded, impressed by Thomas's ability to reframe limitation as opportunity, to find strength in what others might see as weakness. And what did you discover when you started asking that question? Steve asked. Thomas's face lit up with obvious passion as he began discussing the subject that had consumed the last 3 years of his life. I discovered that most cooking techniques can be adapted, that creativity matters more than conformity, and that my disability actually made me a better chef in some ways. I had to slow down, think more carefully about every movement, find more efficient ways to accomplish tasks. I became more precise, more intentional, more innovative. The studio was completely quiet now, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of people unsure how to react. It was the focused attention of individuals recognizing expertise, wisdom, and the kind of hard-won insight that comes from transforming challenge into strength. Steve Harvey had interviewed countless people, but something about Thomas's combination of vulnerability and confidence, his refusal to be defined by limitation while acknowledging the reality of his challenges, moved him in unexpected ways. Thomas, Steve said, you mentioned wanting to open a restaurant that employs disabled chefs. Tell me about that vision. Thomas straightened, clearly excited to discuss the project that had become his primary focus and greatest passion. It's going to be called Adaptive Kitchen, he said, his voice gaining strength as he described his dream. The entire concept is built around the idea that disability doesn't limit culinary talent, it just requires different approaches. We'll have blind chefs who can identify ingredients by smell that sighted chefs might miss, deaf chefs who can focus on visual and tactile aspects of cooking without distraction, chefs in wheelchairs who prove that mobility isn't required for culinary excellence. He gestured with his right hand, his passion making him momentarily forget about his missing limb, and amputee chefs like me, who've learned that one hand can accomplish anything if you're creative enough and determined enough to figure out how. Steve looked at this extraordinary young man who had transformed personal tragedy into a vision for systemic change, who was using his own challenges to create opportunities for others facing similar obstacles. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Thomas, Steve said, I want everyone in this studio to understand what you just shared with us. You didn't just overcome a disability, you turned it into a superpower. The audience began to react, not with pity or sympathy, but with genuine respect and admiration for someone who had refused to let circumstances define possibilities. But Steve wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something unexpected, a small chef's pin that he wore on his lapel, a gift from a celebrity chef friend that had become one of his most treasured accessories. Thomas, Steve said, approaching him with the gravity of someone recognizing true expertise. This pin was given to me by a master chef who told me it represents the highest level of culinary artistry. I've worn it to every important event for the past 5 years. He unpinned it carefully and held it out to Thomas. But I want you to have it, not because you've overcome something, but because you've achieved something. You've redefined what it means to be a chef. You've proven that mastery isn't about having all your parts, it's about using whatever parts you have with complete dedication and creativity. Thomas accepted the pin with obvious emotion, understanding both the symbolic weight of the gesture and the recognition it represented. But I want to do something else, Steve continued. He began removing his suit jacket, the same navy blue jacket he wore for every taping, his signature piece that had become part of his television persona. Master chefs aren't defined by their hands, Steve said, draping the jacket carefully around Thomas's shoulders. They're defined by their hearts, their creativity, their refusal to accept that anything is impossible when it comes to creating something beautiful. The jacket hung differently on Thomas than it would on someone with 2 arms. but he wore it with the dignity of someone receiving a formal recognition of achievement. This jacket has been with me for every show I've hosted this season, Steve continued. But today it belongs to someone who's taught me something about what real mastery looks like. Not the ability to do things the way everyone else does them, but the creativity to find your own way to excellence. Thomas looked down at the jacket, then at Steve, overwhelmed by the recognition and the validation that the gesture represented. "Steve," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you don't understand what this means. For 3 years I've been trying to prove that I'm still a real chef. You're the first person to see me as a master chef, not a disabled chef or an inspirational chef, just a chef who happens to have found unique ways to express his craft." Steve looked at this remarkable young man who had turned limitation into innovation, who had refused to let other people's assumptions about disability define his professional possibilities. "Thomas," Steve said, "you didn't lose your arm and learn to cook anyway. You lost your arm and became a better chef because of it. You're not inspiring despite your disability, you're innovative because of your disability." He turned to address the entire studio. "Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas Mitchell represents something beautiful about human potential, the refusal to accept that our circumstances define our capabilities, the creativity to find new ways to achieve old dreams, the determination to use our challenges as stepping stones rather than roadblocks." The audience erupted in sustained applause, but this time it included something unique. Several people in the audience were actually giving Thomas a chef's salute, having recognized the formal culinary recognition that Steve had just bestowed. As the cameras stopped rolling and the audience began to file out, something remarkable happened. Person after person approached Thomas, not to express sympathy for his loss, but to ask about his restaurant concept, to share their own stories of overcoming physical challenges, to express interest in supporting his vision of inclusive professional kitchens. One elderly veteran approached with tears in his eyes. "Son," he said, "I lost my leg in Vietnam and thought my farming days were over. Watching you today, hearing how you turned your challenge into strength, you've reminded me that adaptation isn't about giving up what you love, it's about finding new ways to love what you've always loved." 6 months later, the episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing to minimize the emotional weight of Thomas's story or Steve's unprecedented gesture. The response was immediate and transformative. Culinary schools across the country reached out to learn about adaptive cooking techniques. Restaurant owners began reconsidering their assumptions about hiring disabled workers. The episode became a training tool for disability rights organizations and vocational rehabilitation programs. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from other disabled individuals who had been told their career dreams were impossible, who saw in Thomas's story proof that limitation is often a failure of imagination rather than a failure of capability. Thomas returned to Portland with renewed confidence and expanded resources. Steve's gesture had given him not just material support, but symbolic validation that his vision was valuable and his expertise was real. The chef's pin became a daily reminder that mastery takes many forms, and the jacket became the uniform he wore while developing the curriculum for his restaurant's training program. Within 18 months, Thomas had secured funding and opened Adaptive Kitchen, which quickly became not just a successful restaurant, but a proving ground for disabled culinary professionals and a training center for adaptive cooking techniques. The establishment gained national recognition not as a charity project or inspirational venture, but as a genuinely excellent restaurant that happened to demonstrate revolutionary approaches to inclusive employment. Steve Harvey said in later interviews that meeting Thomas changed his understanding of disability, adaptation, and what it means to master any craft. "He taught me that the word impossible usually says more about the person using it than about the situation they're describing," Steve said. "Real masters don't just work within limitations, they innovate beyond them." The lesson that day wasn't about overcoming disability or inspiring others through adversity. It was about the truth that creativity and determination can transform any limitation into an opportunity for innovation. That mastery is defined not by conformity, but by the ability to achieve excellence through whatever means are available. Thomas Mitchell proved that losing what you think you need can reveal what you actually have. That adaptation isn't about settling for less but about discovering more. And that sometimes the greatest innovations come from people who are forced to find new ways to pursue old dreams. And Steve Harvey learned that sometimes the most powerful moments in television happen when you recognize not what someone has overcome, but what they have created, not their limitations, but their innovations, not their disabilities, but their unique abilities to show the rest of us what's really possible when we stop accepting that anything is truly impossible.